Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Was Alex Murdaugh having an affair, and were Maggie and Alex separated? Because we know that they were living apart. And if that is the case, well, good for Maddie Murdaugh. It was as though she was reading the tea leaves. You know, she wasn't totally naive, right? And it's just unfortunate that she was lured to. It appears that she was lured to the property from her Edisto Beach home on June 7th. So if they were living apart, if they were apparently separated, well, was divorce on the cards? And if divorce was on the cards, you can imagine that there would be cost implications then, and who might be worrying about that? Who might be greedy in that sense and not wanting? Why don't you just get a divorce, right? Remember those words. Remember what Chris Watts did. Now, according to Fitz News, quote, they've been unable to independently confirm reports that Maggie met with a divorce attorney. So that's been rumored, but there was also talk that Shanann Watts met with a divorce attorney as well prior to her murder. Anyway, it says, quote, however, a meeting like this would not have been inconsistent with what multiple sources have described as the strained status of their relationship, in part because of a rumored affair Alex was having with another attorney, end quote. Well, if all of this is true, then the statement that the defense attorney made during his opening comments about that he was such a loving father and loving husband, well, maybe not so loving. And also, if this is true, we can see multiple potential motives evolving here. If he was the one having an affair, he stood to potentially lose a lot. And there was a lot he couldn't afford to lose given his already rickety finances at that point. But I think the real issue was a divorce would also mean his finances would be investigated and exposed. And that was the thing he really couldn't afford at that time. Before we get to the rest of this episode, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Bear in mind, I'm not doing many lives at the moment. I am doing one later today. On the Baldwin case, there's been an astonishing amount of information that has come out of the probable cause affidavit, 20 separate insights. I'm going to be covering that. And then also look out for continuing coverage on this case, the number one clue we all missed, and then a deep dive into the context, all the whole sort of timeline aspect. So look out for that. If you're enjoying this episode, please like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the defense in their opening statement made a dubious claim about how loving their relationship was, or what a loving father and husband Alex Murdaugh was. And for some reason it didn't ring true, but you didn't quite know why. You didn't specifically know why that might not be the case. And I think it's possible that they did have a loving relationship until it wasn't. So you might have photos and some video of, parties and smiling faces and the family happy together. So I'm sure it was a loving relationship until it wasn't. Just like with Chris Watts, he was this role model father, perfect husband, until he wasn't. An affair also highlights the possible motive I brought up earlier. We appear to be dealing with a greedy, spoiled individual who wants his cake, and lots of it. Now, going back to the article in Fitz News, quote, additionally, on the evening of June 7, Maggie drove to Marital, the family's 1,700-acre hunting property in Islington, South Carolina, about an hour and 15 minutes from their Edisto Beach house. So he probably would stand to lose that house in the divorce, that house would probably come up in a divorce situation. So if she died, what happened to that house? Didn't it go back to him? in any event, Alex asked her to meet him there at this hunting property. And what was at this hunting property? Well, guns. It was also quite remote. In other words, Maggie was lured, according to the article, to what would be the site of her murder. That's according to multiple sources with knowledge of the situation. I think that is certainly possible. It's certainly possible. But doesn't this reek of hitting two birds with one stone? If the idea had first occurred to him to get rid of Maggie and avoid a costly divorce, in other words, the Chris Watts approach, then perhaps just as Chris Watts did, perhaps the idea was to throw Paul into the scheme as well, because of the costly lawsuit he was responsible for as well. I suppose it could have been the other way around as well. After all, Paul's lawsuit, I think, could have been more expensive than the divorce bill. It's actually hard to say because Paul's lawsuit, I'm not quite sure what it was coming up to. I've heard $50 million. But the divorce thing would in any way expose his finances, I think, and so he couldn't really afford either situation to play out. But ultimately, if greed was the motive, doesn't one have a sense of a killer calculating and ultimately cutting his losses? Same thing with Chris Watts. I can't afford to have this child. My wife insists on having the baby. I can't afford a divorce. And then he just adds to that whole murderous psychology. And so one does have to wonder if this was the calculus. Why was Buster allowed to live? Maybe because Buster was living independently. Maybe because Buster to some extent resembled his father much more than Paul did. Maybe because Buster was the firstborn and was sort of part of the family legacy, whereas Maggie and Paul were sort of spoilers to that now in that area. In other words, Buster was sort of a safe bet in a way. Interestingly, Maggie's phone was taken from the scene and found some distance away. I guess the MURDAUGH version of staging a bicycle some distance away, what we saw in the Morphew case and the Mo Wilson case. Now, according to the article from Fitz News, quote, Maggie MURDAUGH's phone, her iPhone, was found in the woods a short distance from Marcel on the day after the murders by the investigators with the 14th Circuit Solicitor's Office. What do you think that was all about? Why do you think the phone was taken from the scene, her phone, and not Paul's phone? Do you remember I said that probably the killer left the scene with whatever he had in his hands? And so he left with the weapon that he was holding when he shot Maggie, and possibly also the phone that he had in his hand after he shot Maggie, right? And then where did he go from there? What did he do after that? And so from Fox News, we get the following. At 12 seconds past, let's say, 9:06:12, so 6 minutes past 9 and 12 seconds, Maggie's phone changed its orientation. This is how sort of the micro detail cell phone analysis now has, where it records every little change in the the logbook basically of a phone in terms of the phone data review. So we know at that time the phone changed its orientation from landscape to portrait. That was something like 15 minutes after the murders, 16 minutes after the murders, and you could surmise that at that point someone had already possibly taken a shower or changed his shirt or put some clothing into the washing machine or whatever. But that phone had changed its orientation from landscape to portrait. If you think about it, landscape is horizontal to portrait, which is vertical. And that was because someone was holding it, right, according to the cell phone expert. 2 seconds later, MURDAUGH called Maggie's phone. So you kind of get the idea that he actually held her phone, somebody held her phone in his hand and then called that number. But then she didn't answer. And then 8 seconds later, the iPhone's orientation change ended, right? Then 31 seconds after that, Alex called Maggie's phone again, right, to say, oh, and then there was a text, and that was 2 minutes, 7 seconds later, where he said, going to check on M, probably his mother, be right back. And then there were no more steps recorded until the next day, when investigators found Maggie's iPhone on the side of Moselle Road, about half a mile from the family's hunting estate. And then he texted at 9:47:23, call me babe, right? And what is that trying to say? It's trying to suggest that they've got a good relationship, right? Those texts are trying to say, just as with Chris Watts, that they've got a good relationship. But do they? It's also interesting how Murdaugh's ironclad narrative has changed over time in terms of his alibi. But we'll deal with that in a forthcoming episode. Once again, bear in mind I'm going to be doing a live on the latest information that has come out of the probable cause affidavit. I think there's something like 8 or 10 pages, but 20 different insights out of that. So make sure you don't miss it. That should be at 5 p.m. Eastern Time or around about 2 p.m. Pacific Time. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.